Turn that music off, or I'm calling the cops. Ma'am, it's 4 p.m. I don't care. This is a private lake. Yeah. That's Karen screaming at me from across the dock with a literal megaphone. At first, I thought she was filming some sort of noise complaint PSA. Nope. She was just broadcasting her rage to the entire neighborhood, like a one-woman emergency alert system. Hit like if you've ever met someone who mistakes other people's peace for personal offense. Subscribe for more stories where karma shows up with surround sound. And settle in because this Karen was about to learn what happens when you pick a sound war with a guy who used to run audio at music festivals. It began on what was supposed to be the quietest weekend of my year. The kind of weekend where you wake up to the sound of loons, not lawnmowers, and where the only thing you plan to fight is the urge to check your phone. The lake was glassy that morning, the air just cool enough to carry the scent of pine and water, and I was halfway through unpacking boxes in my new cabin. It was my first real home since the divorce, and I had been telling myself this place would be a reset button for everything. A place to fish, to write, maybe to finally learn how to cook something other than reheated takeout. But more than anything, I wanted peace. What I got instead was a woman named Karen, with a megaphone the size of a small child and lungs that could probably shatter glass. The first incident happened the same day I finished setting up my sound system. I'd always been a music guy, not the loud, obnoxious kind, just someone who liked to have a little soundtrack while working. So, I queued up a mellow jazz playlist on my deck speakers, barely enough to reach the dock. The sun was starting to set, and for a few minutes, life felt good. Then came the sound. It wasn't the usual peaceful mix of birds and water. It was a blaring, distorted voice, cutting through the stillness, like a police siren. Turn that music off, or I'm calling the authorities. I looked up, confused, scanning the opposite dock. There she was, robe, slippers, hair tied up like she was about to go to war with the concept of fun itself. Her megaphone gleamed under the fading light, like it had been polished for this exact performance. I tried to respond politely, raising my voice enough for her to hear. Ma'am, it's not even that loud, I said, gesturing toward my phone to show her the volume setting. She shook her head so violently her sunglasses flew off, yelling back something about lake noise ordinances and community tranquility. At first, I thought maybe she was joking, or at least exaggerating. Maybe she had a headache, or maybe she'd mistaken me for one of those kids who blasted bass-heavy EDM across the lake on weekends. But within minutes, she was back out with a clipboard and what appeared to be printed regulations. I could hear her muttering into her megaphone about decibel limits and sound pollution thresholds. Whatever that meant. The absurdity of the situation would have been funny if it wasn't so surreal. I went inside, turned off the music, and decided to let it go. I'd had enough conflict for one lifetime. Divorce, city traffic, angry clients. No reason to add an angry lakeside stranger to the list. The silence was almost peaceful again, until I heard the faint crackle of a microphone. See? That's better, she announced triumphantly to no one in particular. People come here for peace. I realized she wasn't talking to me anymore. She was talking to her audience, whoever that might be, or maybe just to herself. Either way, it felt like a performance she'd been waiting to give. That night, I called a local friend who lived a few cabins down and asked if he knew the woman across the lake. He groaned the moment I described her. That's Karen. She's been here since before the HOA even existed. Thinks she's the sound sheriff of the lake. Don't take it personally. She's yelled at jet skis, fireworks, even frogs. He wasn't exaggerating. Apparently, last summer she filed a formal complaint with the county over bullfrogs keeping her awake. The next morning, I tried to start fresh. No music, no power tools, just coffee and quiet. I thought maybe if I didn't give her a reason to complain, she'd move on. But around noon, when a light breeze knocked over my wind chime and it clinked softly against the railing, the megaphone crackled to life again. You can't have those here. Sound carries across water. I just stood there, cup in hand, staring at the lake that was supposed to be my sanctuary, realizing that tranquility might not exist when someone like Karen was determined to police it. Somewhere between disbelief and resignation, I started laughing. Because what else do you do when your biggest problem isn't noise, but the person obsessed with eliminating it? The lake was calm, the air was still, and across the water, My new neighbor stood on her dock like a general preparing for battle, megaphone in hand, ready to defend silence itself. By the end of that first week, I'd begun to understand that Karen's commitment to the art of disruption was not a passing mood, but a full-time occupation. She had a schedule, I swear she did, and it revolved around finding new reasons to yell through that megaphone. The woman operated with the precision of a military strategist, except her battlefield was my property line, and her weapon of choice was battery-powered amplification. I could predict her appearances almost down to the minute. Mornings around 9, she'd appear in her robe to inspect the lake for disturbances, coffee in one hand, megaphone in the other. In the afternoons, she'd conduct what she called sound checks, which meant blasting her own voice across the water to confirm that her voice could still drown out the ducks. The absurdity of it all was exhausting. I tried every method I could think of to reason with her, short of hiring a mediator. One day, I walked across the small bridge that connected our sides of the lake and approached her dock with a peace offering, a thermos of coffee and a smile. "Morning, Karen," I said, careful not to startle her. "Thought I'd bring you some coffee. Maybe we can talk about the noise situation." She looked at me the way a security guard might look at a trespasser who just admitted to committing a crime. "Oh, I know who you are," she said, lifting the megaphone like a judge raising a gavel. "You're the one with the bass speakers." I opened my mouth to explain that my speakers had only ever played soft jazz, but she wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in theater. "You're disturbing the ecosystem. Do you know what vibrations do to migrating fish?" she shouted, though the only fish I'd seen in days were the ones swimming happily under my dock. I took a slow breath, the kind of deep inhale therapists tell you to take when you're about to lose your temper. "Karen," I said as calmly as possible, "I'm not trying to cause problems. I just moved here. I'd like us to be good neighbors." She gave a dramatic sigh, and for a moment, I thought she might relent. Then she raised her clipboard and began listing fabricated violations in a voice that carried across the entire lake. Unregistered outdoor audio equipment, unauthorized sound projection, possible noise, based property devaluation. She was inventing laws faster than I could refute them. By that evening, I found a piece of paper taped to my mailbox. It looked official at first glance, printed letterhead, bold text, the words, "Community Noise Enforcement," stamped across the top. But when I looked closer, I noticed that the address listed under Office of Compliance was Karen's own. She had created a fake HOA, complete with penalties and citations. The fine for persistent auditory disturbance was $200, payable to her personal address. I laughed so hard I almost dropped my mail. Still, the laughter didn't last. A few days later, she took things further. Around sunset, I was sitting on my deck with a glass of wine when her megaphone cracked through the evening air again. "This is a warning," she declared, pacing along her dock like she was addressing an army. "Repeated offenses will result in community action." The lake echoed with her voice, and I could see lights turning on in nearby cabins. Other residents had begun to notice. A man from 2 docks down shouted for her to quiet down. Someone else yelled that they were calling the sheriff. Karen didn't flinch. "Call them!" she yelled back. "I'm protecting our peace!" The next morning, I woke to find new signs posted around my driveway. "Noise violator resides here." Each one laminated, each one signed, authorized by the Lakefront Preservation Council. A council that, of course, did not exist. She had even stapled one to a tree by the mailboxes, like she was leading a moral crusade against decibels. That was when I started keeping a log. Dates, times, recordings. I wasn't planning revenge, not yet. I just wanted documentation, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. But as the entries filled page after page, I realized this wasn't just harassment, it was obsession. Every hour she spent yelling about peace was another hour she spent disturbing it. I could almost admire her consistency if it weren't so maddening. By the end of week 2, I stopped trying to reason with her. Reasoning required logic, and logic had long since packed up and left the neighborhood. My friends from the city came to visit one weekend, eager to see my quiet getaway. Within 15 minutes of stepping onto the dock, Karen had appeared, megaphone in hand, yelling at them for laughing too loud. They looked at me, bewildered. as though I had moved into some experimental neighborhood for people allergic to sound. When they left that night, my best friend pulled me aside and whispered, "You know she's going to keep doing this, right? You either move or you teach her what real noise sounds like." Oh, and that's when something in my brain clicked. For weeks, she had treated me like I was the problem, like my very existence was an offense against her fragile sense of peace. But if noise was her weapon, maybe it was time to show her how it felt when someone else decided to play her game and play it better. When I finally decided to fight back, it wasn't out of anger, it was out of exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones when reason has failed and silence has become a luxury. Every evening I would sit on my porch with a cup of tea, pretending I couldn't hear the faint hum of Karen's megaphone crackling to life somewhere across the lake. She had begun timing her outbursts for maximum disruption, always during dinner, always when I'd just settled into a peaceful rhythm. Sometimes it was a speech about noise ordinances, other times a monologue about respecting community standards. She'd call it education, though to everyone else it sounded like warfare. I realized I had two choices. I could keep pretending it didn't bother me, or I could remind her that I wasn't the kind of man who backed down from a challenge. So I went to the storage shed behind the cabin and pulled out the one thing I knew would shift the balance of power. My old event speakers. They were relics from my past life, heavy and dented from years of use at outdoor festivals and small-town concerts, but still perfectly functional. I ran my hand over the metal casing and smiled at the thought of using them again, not for a crowd this time, but for one very specific audience. I spent the entire afternoon setting them up along the edge of my property, hidden behind shrubs and positioned to face her dock. It was oddly therapeutic, like preparing a ritual that had been waiting for the right moment to be performed. That night I didn't play anything. I just sat on the porch and waited. Around 8:30, the familiar squawk of her megaphone echoed across the water. "Some people never learn," she shouted, her voice amplified to the point of distortion. I waited until she finished her usual rant about maintaining the serenity of the lake before I stood, stretched, and plugged in the cables. Then, as the stars began to scatter across the dark surface of the water, I pressed play. It wasn't rock or heavy metal or anything aggressive. It was polka. Bright, bouncy, absurdly cheerful polka. The kind of music that could make a funeral feel festive. The accordion notes leapt across the lake like fireworks, echoing off the trees and the water with perfect clarity. The rhythm was relentless, impossible to ignore, and most importantly, perfectly within the legal noise limits. I had checked the decibel readings 3 times just to be sure. At first I thought maybe she would laugh, maybe she'd take the joke in stride, realize how ridiculous this whole feud had become. But as I watched from my deck, I could see her shadow pacing back and forth, the beam from her flashlight darting across the water like a restless animal. After a few minutes, the megaphone crackled to life again, but her words were lost beneath the rolling surge of brass and percussion. The polka drowned her out completely. Neighbors began turning on their lights. Some peeked through curtains, others came out to their porches to listen. A few even clapped along, their laughter carrying across the lake. The sound wasn't angry or chaotic, it was joyful. It felt like the whole neighborhood had been waiting for someone to puncture the tension she'd created. And for the first time in weeks, the lake didn't sound haunted by one woman's obsession. It sounded alive. By 10 o'clock, Karen had given up shouting. Her porch light flicked off, and the megaphone's echo finally died. I turned the volume down to a whisper and let the last song play out, the accordion fading into the night. The air felt lighter somehow, cleaner. I hadn't realized how heavy her presence had been until that moment of release. The next morning, I woke to silence. No megaphone, no shouted decrees, no laminated violation notices taped to my mailbox. The lake looked peaceful again, sunlight dancing on the ripples as if nothing had ever happened. I brewed my coffee and sat by the window, waiting for the sound of her screen door, but it never came. For a while I thought maybe she'd finally accepted defeat. Then, around noon, I saw a small figure trudging up my driveway holding something bright orange. It was one of her signs, the ones that used to declare my property a noise violation zone. She had rewritten it. In thick black marker, it now read, "Acceptable noise levels agreed upon." She hammered it into the ground by the edge of my dock, adjusted it twice, then walked away without saying a word. I couldn't help but laugh. That afternoon I turned on the speakers again, but this time I played something soft. The kind of music you'd hear at a Sunday picnic. Across the lake, a single curtain lifted, and for a brief moment, I saw her standing there, watching quietly. No megaphone, no clipboard, just Karen, listening. And in that strange silence between songs, I almost thought I heard the faintest sound of someone humming along. For a few quiet days, it seemed like peace had finally returned to the lake. The mornings were calm again, the kind of calm I had been dreaming about since the day I bought the place. The only sounds were the gentle lap of water against the dock, the birds in the pines, and the soft rustle of leaves that carried through the breeze. I could almost convince myself that the whole megaphone saga had been a strange fever dream brought on by stress and isolation. But peace, as I learned, was something Karen could never leave untouched for long. It started with a note. I found it tucked under my door one morning, folded neatly and smelling faintly of lavender. It wasn't threatening. Not exactly. It was worse than that. It was condescending. In looping cursive she had written, "While I appreciate your efforts to maintain community harmony, please remember that appropriate sound levels should reflect respect for shared spaces. Loud music of any kind, even whimsical genres, can be triggering for individuals who have auditory sensitivities. Warm regards, Karen." It was the kind of letter that smiled while it insulted you, the sort of message meant to remind you she was still in charge, even after losing the battle. I set it on the counter and laughed, though it sounded more like a sigh than amusement. By afternoon, she was back outside with her megaphone, though this time it wasn't to shout. She was hosting something she called the Lakefront Awareness Forum, which was just her and two visibly uncomfortable neighbors listening to her read from printed articles about sound pollution and vibrational toxicity. The irony was painful. Her voice boomed across the water as she lectured about preserving tranquility, while I sat on my porch, sipping coffee, wondering how someone could talk about peace while creating so much noise. That evening, I saw her pacing near her dock again, phone pressed to her ear, voice hushed but animated. She glanced toward my house several times, then pointed as though explaining something. I assumed she was complaining to someone new, maybe the county office or an environmental agency. I didn't think much of it until the next morning, when two men in reflective vests appeared at my door. They introduced themselves as noise compliance officers from the county, responding to a report of ongoing sound disturbances affecting local wildlife. The taller one had a clipboard and a weary expression that told me this wasn't his first encounter with her. I invited them in, showed them my decibel reader, my permits, and the documentation, proving everything was within regulation. They were polite, even apologetic, explaining that the report they'd received was unusually detailed and aggressively worded. I knew exactly what that meant. Before they left, the shorter one said quietly, "Between you and me, we get a complaint from this area about once a month. You're not the first." I nodded, pretending not to care, but inside I felt that old frustration creeping back. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I caught sight of something that made me pause. Karen was sitting on her dock, not yelling, not filming, just sitting. Her megaphone rested beside her, unused. For the first time, she looked tired. I don't know what possessed me, but I walked down to my own dock and called across the water. "Beautiful evening, huh?" I expected her to ignore me, or maybe shout something snide in return, but she just nodded. The silence stretched out between us, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Then she said something I didn't expect. "You have good speakers," she called out, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "You really do." I didn't know whether it was an olive branch or sarcasm, but I decided to take it as the former. "Thank you," I replied. "Polka's not for everyone, but it gets the point across." She gave a short laugh, small but genuine, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like the war might finally be over. Over the next few days, we fell into an unspoken truce. I kept my music low, and she kept her megaphone out of sight. We nodded at each other in passing, polite but distant, like soldiers who'd agreed to lay down arms but hadn't forgotten the fight. The tension never disappeared completely, but it softened, fading into something almost tolerable. One evening, just as the last light faded and the lake turned silver in the moonlight, I decided to play something gentle old swing music, barely audible beyond my deck. To my surprise, When I glanced across the water, I saw her lights still on and her window open. The curtain fluttered, and I thought I heard faint humming. It wasn't much, just a single note here and there, but it was enough. Maybe she'd never admit it out loud, but I think part of her missed the sound she had tried so hard to silence. Maybe it wasn't the music she hated after all, but the idea that it came from someone else. That night, as I sat by the water listening to the quiet melody drift between us, I realized that some people don't fight noise, they fight the idea of not being in control. And sometimes the only way to end that battle is to let the silence speak louder than any song ever could. A few weeks passed, and by then, the lake had settled into a rhythm again. The water was clear and slow, the days gentle and predictable. The drama that had once dominated the shoreline had dissolved into something resembling normal life. I started sleeping better, cooking more, even inviting friends for weekend visits again. Karen stayed quiet. There were no more fake violation notices, no impromptu neighborhood meetings, no blaring megaphone announcements. Every morning when I glanced across the lake, I'd see her tending her garden or sweeping her deck, her movements deliberate and calm. It was strange to witness such quiet from someone who had once treated tranquility like an enemy. It would have been easy to believe the story ended there, that the noise war had burned itself out, leaving behind only a truce built on mutual exhaustion. But peace has a fragile way of testing your patience. One Saturday afternoon, while I was working on my dock repairs, I noticed a familiar sound, a faint, mechanical crackle that made my stomach tighten. For a moment I thought I was imagining it, a phantom echo of months past. Then I heard it again, the distinct buzz of feedback, followed by a voice saying, "Testing, testing." I stood frozen, hammer in hand, listening. The sound didn't come from her deck this time. It was muffled, like it came from inside her house. After a moment the voice continued, not through a megaphone but through what sounded like a headset microphone. "Welcome back to another Lakefront Living educational series," she said, her tone suddenly bright and rehearsed. I realized she had moved her campaign online. Later that evening, curiosity got the better of me. I searched the phrase she had used and found a newly created YouTube channel with her name proudly displayed in elegant script. There she was, filmed from her living room, giving long, dramatic monologues about community order and the dangers of sound aggression. Her first video had already gathered a few hundred views. She spoke about preserving peace while using clips from her past experiences, which I quickly recognized as edited fragments from our encounters. She had taken moments of me setting up speakers or walking along my dock and cut them into something that made her look like a victim of harassment. The comments were full of sympathy from people who believed every word. For a while, I didn't know how to react. I wanted to be angry, but mostly I just felt tired. The thought of engaging her again, even digitally, made my head ache. So I did nothing. I went on with my life, tending to my dock, cooking dinners, enjoying evenings of quiet. But what surprised me most was what happened next. The videos stopped coming. After the first few uploads, her channel went dormant. No new lectures, no community updates. A month passed in complete silence, and then one morning, she was gone. Her house looked empty. The curtains were drawn, the dock spotless but untouched. Neighbors said she had moved to stay with her sister in another state, something about needing a break from ungrateful locals. I didn't know whether to laugh or feel sorry for her. Part of me wondered if she had finally realized that peace couldn't be forced on other people, that silence meant more when it wasn't demanded through a megaphone. That night, the lake was quieter than I had ever heard it. The air was still, the moon bright enough to ripple off the surface like silver. I sat on my deck with a small speaker playing softly beside me. It wasn't polka this time, or jazz, or anything designed to provoke. It was a slow instrumental song, something simple and kind. The notes drifted lazily across the water, mixing with the whisper of the wind. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to look over my shoulder, to check if she was listening or waiting to shout. When the song ended, I let the silence stretch. I thought about how strange it was that someone could spend so much energy fighting against sound only to vanish into it. In her absence, the lake felt both bigger and emptier, like the quiet itself had grown into something sacred. I realized that sometimes Winning doesn't look like triumph or revenge. Sometimes it just looks like sitting alone by the water, unbothered, unchallenged, and free. Before I went inside, I caught one last sound from across the lake, a faint metallic clink, maybe from a loose dock chain or an old wind chime left behind. It was small and harmless, almost comforting. I smiled at the thought that maybe, somewhere far away, she had found a quieter shore to protect, one that didn't need defending. I turned off the lights, leaving the lake to its stillness. The stars reflected off the water like a second sky, and for the first time since moving there, the night felt exactly as it should, calm, unbroken, and finally, completely mine. And that, my friends, is how a woman with a megaphone learned that volume isn't the same as authority. If you've stuck around this long without checking your own speaker volume, you deserve a medal and maybe some noise-cancelling headphones. Remember, a peaceful neighborhood doesn't require silence. It just requires people who mind their own decibels. Hit that subscribe button if you enjoy stories where karma dances to the right tune, and drop a comment about your loudest neighbor experience. I read them all, preferably at a reasonable volume. Until next time, may your weekends be calm, your playlists be legal, and your Karens keep their megaphones on mute.